We're going to focus on the work of Dr. Michael Chesser, neurologist, who visited the National Archives earlier this year. He was able to view the so-called original autopsy x-rays and photographs. We're going to focus, first of all, on the so-called white patch. This is a name that I gave to an area on JFK's lateral skull x-rays. This area in prints looks very white, which is why I called it a white patch. It's located between the top of the ear and the back of the head, and it occupies most of that area from front to back. It's actually fairly large, almost fist-sized. So I'm going to talk for a minute about the lateral x-ray. Now, Dr. Chesser did something that I had not done. He actually got permission from the JFK Library in Boston, Massachusetts. And while there, he was able to view the pre-mortem lateral skull x-ray of JFK. That's the x-ray taken of JFK while he was still alive. It's only located there in Boston, which is why I have not seen it in person. I've seen copies of it, of course, which are available to the public and which I've shown in many lectures. But the point is that Dr. Michael Chesser took his optical densitometer with him to Boston and was actually able to obtain measurements from that x-ray. Now, that's very interesting because that lateral x-ray does not show the white patch. It's only on the post-mortem x-rays. So you have data from both the post-mortem and the pre-mortem on the same image. Now, it's pretty obvious that there's no white patch on the pre-mortem x-ray to anybody who looks at it. But what we did then was to actually compare the numbers. And here's how we did the comparison. The comparison site is the petrous bone. This is the densest bone in the human body. It surrounds the ear canal, and that area is readily visible on the pre-mortem and post-mortem x-ray. So both Dr. Chesser and I took measurements of that very dense, very white-appearing bone. Then Mike and I also had measurements on the post-mortem x-ray, and our measurements agreed. That's a very important point all by itself. Our optical density data agreed on the postmortem. That's very important. It's additional assurance that we're looking at the same film and that we took data properly. But now the key is to compare the white patch to the petrous bone. So we just took a ratio. You can take an average optical density data number from the white patch, and then what we did was we took the optical density data from the petrous bone around the ear and divided it by the data from the parietal bone. And the numbers are totally different for the premortem versus the postmortem. Here are the numbers. On the premortem, the ratio is 0.43. On the postmortem, it's 0.89. Now, a number close to 1 means, of course, that the densities are almost the same. And that was what was odd on the postmortem, because the white patch suggests that JFK's head was almost completely boned from left to right on that lateral x-ray. Of course, that's not what normal patients are supposed to be like. So, I also have some data on normal patients. I had 10 patients in whom I did these same measurements. And very interesting, very importantly, the numbers on those patients agree very much with JFK's premortem. In other words, JFK was normal before his autopsy, but then after the autopsy, this white patch crops up. Well, this gets even more interesting if you think about something else. A really dense area of bone, like the white patch represents, should be visible on the x-ray taken from the front, too. In fact, when you look at the frontal x-ray, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that corresponds to that white patch. If JFK's lateral x-ray suggests bone all the way through from left to right side, where is that object on the frontal x-ray? It has to be there somewhere if this is a real object. But there's nothing. Such an extremely dense object as the white patch represents should have been as visible as a T-Rex in downtown Manhattan at noon, but there's nothing there. So these are all very powerful, powerful indications that the white patch was faked on afterwards, almost certainly in the darkroom. And so Dr. Chesser and I have agreed on this, that the lateral x-rays, both the left and right lateral, must have been modified, most likely in the darkroom, to achieve this effect. This is the first time that anybody has confirmed my measurements since I first took them well over 20 years ago. So that's the rate of progress in this case. Rather astonishing. Nobody has done that since.
Do you think that this would have happened at Bethesda?
Well, remember Gerald Custer's recollections of that weekend. He says that he was told by John Ebersol, the radiologist, to place bullet fragments on skull fragments and intact skulls too, and take x-rays of them. And he was given the reason for this. He said that Ebersol told him that they needed this information to make a bust of JFK. Now, of course, that makes absolutely no sense, and Custer was very aware of that. But he just kept his mouth shut and did what he was told. So, pretty clearly, something strange was going on that very weekend. And this all is consistent with their attempts to alter the x-rays. We also know this. John Ebersol was called back to the White House by the Secret Service. And while at the White House, he was shown the autopsy x-rays of the skull. And he drew a pencil line on one of them. And here's what's key. That pencil line is still there. I saw it when I went to the National Archives. It's only on one side of the film, which means that film has not been altered since Ebersol drew that line. So we have a potential beginning date that very weekend and a potential ending date. That time interval is the only time interval in which that could have occurred, and it's no more than a few weeks at the most.
The point I would probably be trying to make it then that this has nothing to do with Lee Oswald. This has to do with an orchestrated effort from the get-go. By the time the body got to Bethesda, there was something in the works there.
Sure.
Do you have any further thoughts on that? Because was it Ebersol that said he was carrying a stack of x-rays up at the time when the Jackie and the other limo shows up there?
No, that was Gerald Custer.
Right, so he's saying we've already been, who the hell have we been x-raying if that's the body there, you know?
Yeah, this is an excellent point. So it's likely, according to Doug Horn's work, that the body, JFK's body, actually arrived probably in a shipping casket at about 6:35 p.m. There at Bethesda. And the x-rays were taken probably within the next hour, maybe even a lesser time interval than that, right afterwards. So Gerald Custer is using a portable x-ray unit. So he's taken the x-rays, and he has to go upstairs through the rotunda, through an elevator to the fourth floor in order to develop these, because that's where the x-ray suite was. He's working in the morgue, which doesn't have an x-ray suite for developing. So he has to go walking through doors into the rotunda, and just as he is about to enter the rotunda, he sees Jackie coming in. And Jackie supposedly had arrived at the front entrance with the bronze casket from Dallas. That's the bronze casket that JFK's body was supposed to be in. So you're right. What in the world was Custer x-raying before that got there? Well, I think we understand now that the bronze casket, when it arrived at the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, did not hold the body of JFK. His body had arrived about 6:35. And if you want a time, the bronze casket arrived at the front of the hospital around 7 o'clock. So it was about 25 minutes later. So that gave Custer time to take some x-rays before the bronze casket got there and before Jackie got there.
The fix is already in. And someone must have said, look, we're going to go with 3 shots. It's got to be 6.5. You guys got to find a chunk of 6.5 ammo somewhere in the body. I'm confident that was placed on the x-ray and not even in JFK's brain. It was just put there to be something 6.5 millimeters.
Yeah, I think that was done in the darkroom. It would have been very easy to do that in the darkroom via a double exposure. So that also is curious, isn't it, that the 6.5 millimeter fake that appears on the frontal x-ray in JFK's right orbit was not seen during the autopsy by anybody, nor was it even discussed. It only shows up several years later with the Clark panel report. So almost certainly that was added later, and it's pretty straightforward and easy in that era to do it in the darkroom with a double exposure.
Now, talking to Dr. Chesser, which you must have, what made him go to the library there and start looking for this?
I think he was just curious, like many of us are. He really wanted to know what had happened. And he came up with something else that's really incredible, something I had missed and everyone else had missed. There is a very powerful evidence of a shot from the front coming in the high right forehead. That's the area that I have pinpointed for a shot too. But Chesser found more evidence for that I had overlooked, and so had everyone else. To be specific, it's high in the right forehead, probably very, very close to the hairline. And what he found was a whole collection of tiny metallic particles just inside the skull. And he also found a distinct hole in the bone, suggesting that a projectile had passed through there and or a fracture had occurred, or maybe both. So you've got a hole in the skull, and you have all these tiny metallic particles that are just inside the skull. They're very, very powerful evidence of a frontal shot, and their location is what's key. They're just inside the skull, so they could only have come from a projectile from the front. We know that the very small particles travel the shortest distance, and so because they're just inside the skull, they must have come from the front. That is probably the most powerful evidence in this case that we have seen that supports a frontal shot, and it is totally consistent with what I have said for a long, long time. There was a shot that entered high in JFK's right forehead, very close to the hairline, which is probably why a lot of people didn't see it. His thick mat of red hair probably covered it up at Parkland, although we do have a few reports of people who said they saw it there, and also could easily have covered it up at the autopsy. In the autopsy photographs, you can see online, there's an incision, like a scalpel incision, right through the area where this bullet probably entered. It's quite possible that Humes, the autopsy pathologist, deliberately incised that area so as to cover up that bullet hole. And curiously enough, the other autopsy pathologist, Boswell, actually said, quote, "An incised wound," end quote, was located there. What in the world is an incised wound? Well, it's a wound that has a scalpel sliced through it. Something happened before the official autopsy began. Doug Horn has proposed that Humes himself did some things that he shouldn't have been doing before the official autopsy. His purpose could only have been to remove bullet fragments that suggested more than one headshot.
Do you have a conclusion? Do you want to talk about how many wounds do you think there would have been to the skull, to the head?
Yes, I think there were 3 headshots. It's really almost inescapable. So we have the one forehead shot near the hairline, the one we've been talking about. Then we have one shot from the posterior. I agree with the pathologist that there was probably an entry low on the back of the head on the right side. Then there has to be a third one. The third one is the one that knocked out the Harper fragment, which was on the high occipital area. And we have lots and lots of witnesses to exactly such a shot that came in near the right ear. The closest witnesses, the 2 Newmans and Zapruder, both saw the evidence of such a shot near the right ear. So lists a lot of other witnesses at Parkland and at Bethesda who reported such a shot. Here's a great example. James Jenkins, who stood at the autopsy table all night long, said he saw a small entrance wound there, 5 millimeters or so, and the edges were gray, consistent with the passage of a lead bullet. So my conclusion is that's the third shot. It came in near the right ear, probably just in front of the right ear, perhaps a little above it. And that's at the right level to knock out the Harper fragment, which was a bone at the back of the skull. So we have 2 frontal shots then, right ear, right forehead, and then we have a shot from the back as well that the pathologist identified, and I agree with that.
Well, it's much different than what the Warren Commission reported.
Oh my gosh, very, very different. And Chesser's detailed examination of that forehead area is just extraordinary. It's a perfect final nail in this scenario. And of course, in the ebook, I also discussed the observation of Quentin Schwinn, who saw what looked for all the world like an autopsy photograph of JFK, an authentic one, that actually showed that bullet hole high in the forehead. And he used a medical illustrator to reconstruct what he remembered, and it fits perfectly with what Dr. Michael Chesser saw on the x-rays. So this case for the forehead shot is virtually closed at this point. There's hardly anything more that needs to be said about it. In the autopsy photographs, you can see a metal brace that is holding up JFK's head. Now, what's curious about this brace is that nobody remembers it. The autopsy personnel remember using instead was a block with very varying thicknesses. So they could choose how much of support they wanted on the head of the person on the table. So nobody remembers this. Now, remember how the x-rays were taken. There's an x-ray from the front. That metal brace does not appear in that x-ray. There's no way we could have missed seeing that metal brace. After all, it's metal. The metal brace is not there on the x-ray, on any of the x-rays of the skull. So the only conclusion we're left with is, in my opinion, there was photographic alteration. So the metal brace is taking on even more importance than I think we had thought before.